Hey everyone, we're happy to have you with us today for another great session of Leader to Leader. I see many of you have already started by doing introductions in the chat, which is awesome. Today, we just want to start with just some introductions, and I have MASSP staff. So we've got Bob Kefjan with us today, and Bob is our lobbyist, and he's going to be kind of going through those legislative pieces. We also have MASSP's Director of Digital Learning, Ryan Casey, with us today. And we have two special guests. Of course, if we're going to talk winter sports, we have to have the MHSAA Executive Director, Mark Yule, with us. And this is Mark's second guest appearance during COVID, which we really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to be able to be with us, Mark. And then we also have a longtime member of the Representative Council for the MHSAA and Director of the Catholic League, Vic Michaels, to kind of, talk to us about not just what's required, but also how do you implement this? What advice do you have? So I think we'll get a really good perspective on a number of things today. So really appreciate everyone joining us. I also just want to remind you too, that if you scroll along the bottom of your screen, those of you who are familiar with Zoom will know this, but you'll be able to see that we have a chat function and we also have a Q&A function. So the chat is kind of as you're posting your names and introductions, that's what we like to use that for, or even just if you want to make a comment as things are going on. But if you actually want a question to be posed to any of our panelists, please make sure that you put those in the Q&A. It just makes it easier for us to be able to monitor and make sure that we get your questions answered as well. When you are using the chat, you want to make sure that the blue pull-down menu, it will say panelists or panelists and attendees or just attendees. So you want to make sure that you hit panelists and attendees so that everybody can see your comments. And lastly, just want to remind you that at the end of this presentation, you will receive an email with the slide deck and also a link to the recording of today's session. So thanks for being with us. But if somebody misses it, you can go ahead and share that link with a colleague. Today, sometimes we make a disclaimer just kind of reminding people that we're not attorneys. And so sometimes things are up for interpretation. So we always want to make sure that if you have a question that kind of is a gray area, that you seek legal counsel if you need to, or you want to check with your superintendent and just kind of make sure that, how you're going to implement something is exactly the right way. I already introduced our panelists, so I think we're good to go. So Mark, I know that, we kind of thought that when winter sports, was kind of stalled, we were wondering kind of when things were going to get up and running again. And I can only imagine what your phone looked like waiting for waiting for a decision. And you were probably getting a lot of the same emails and calls that I was getting from people just saying, when are things going to start? What's going to happen? So I know all of us were really happy when it finally did happen and we were able to kind of get up and running here. So Bob Kefjan is going to walk us through the epidemic order and some of just those legislative pieces. And then Mark is going to talk more from the MHSAA perspective. I think sometimes people get confused on what is actually legislated and required, and then what is within the MHSAA's control or purview. So I think it'll be good for people to get both of those. So I think we're going to start out with Bob.
Yep. So you guys are, I'm sure at this point, intimately familiar with the February 4th epidemic order, which said basically that contact sports are back on, and it set some provisions around what needs to be done in order to accommodate that, right? And this is what it said around contact sports. Not a whole ton of stipulations, but knowing that there was going to be more guidance as suggested here on February 7th. So we got the initial order February 4th that said, yep, contact sports will restart on Monday, February 8th. Mask where you can, and where you can't, we're going to do some testing protocols. Other than that, a lot of these regulations were the same as they were for non-contact sports, which had been back for a while. There were now a lot of folks have been asking, okay, what method in decision making, how are those being tracked? What does that look like? So we got that information from the governor's office via her press release. And we see here that these are the metrics that they're looking at: hospital capacity, COVID-19 case rates, and overall percent positivity. And that at least the metrics when this happened were all declining in all three of those areas. So good to see at least where they're looking at for these key metrics moving forward. And then on February 7th, so this past Sunday, we got interim guidance for athletics from the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services. This guidance offered some clarity, but deferred decisions about mask safety for particular sports to organizing bodies. It did provide details on a testing regime for unmasked competition and practice, and identified some other mitigation measures. And so I'm going to walk through briefly specifics of what were in these orders and guidance, and then hopefully identify some of the gaps and pass that off to Mark to fill in the details. So for masked sports, the requirements are here that athletes remain masked at all times during competition, on the sidelines, in the locker rooms. They recommend strongly that you replace masks that become saturated with sweat, and for coaches, staff, and spectators, masks must be worn at all times. For unmasked sports, athletes need to remain masked except during play. That means on the sidelines and in between matches, and remove masks just prior to competition and replace them after coming off the court or the mat. And coaches, staff, and spectators, again, need to wear masks at all times. What the order didn't specify, and I'll get to this in a second, is specifically which sports fall into which categories. A lot of that was left to organizing bodies. And so hopefully we can get some more detail on that. The testing regime that was laid out for sports where athletes could not safely mask was that athletes either night had to have a negative antigen test within 24 hours of competition or practice, and if positive, isolate, follow up with a PCR test, and sit out. Or if they had a negative PCR test, that's the full test, the longer time horizon test within 72 hours of competition or practice. And if they were positive, then isolate for 10 days if asymptomatic, or per CDC guidelines if they were symptomatic. Testing was waived for athletes who've recovered from a confirmed case of COVID-19 in the last 3 months and remain symptom-free. In other words, those athletes who've been confirmed in the last 3 months and remain symptom-free, these rules do not require a test before competing without a mask on in unmasked sports. Spectator rules, not a ton of change here. The gathering rules apply. In other words, social distancing, masking for spectators, etc. The crowd limits, for anybody that needs to know them, are there. If you have more than 10,000 fixed seats in your venue, you get 500 people. If you have under 10,000 seats, you get 20% of your capacity, up to a maximum of 250 people. If there are no fixed seats in your venue, say an ice rink with no bleachers, you get 100 people. For bowling lanes and swimming venues, it's 25% of capacity for those venues. So it's, again, a little bit different depending on, and your rules are different depending on which sport you're playing and where you're playing it. The order also has a recommendation of no more than 2 guests per athlete, but that's not a hard and fast rule. It's just a recommendation. Other quick notes on this. There is testing available for all sports. It's not just limited to those sports where tests are required. MDHHS said that testing would be available and was recommended for other sports as well. A couple of pieces I pulled out that I do want to highlight. Did recommend avoiding areas with presentation, and the would certainly qualify. It was a dingy closet, so you may want to consider moving your wrestling practice out of a space like that. They recommended avoiding group travel as possible. So again, busing kids to meets, maybe you can avoid it, maybe that's the only way to get there, but there was a recommendation to avoid group travel if possible. These rules apply to all sports, not just MHSAA sports. So if you have a club sport in your school that isn't an MHSAA sport, these rules apply there as well. And concessions are allowed subject to the same rules as other venues like movie theaters. What was not covered in these orders in any detail was an answer about which sports fall into which category. What are masked sports, which are testing sports, which are, don't fall into either category. The order seems to open up the potential for masking as an alternative in testing as an alternative in otherwise masked sports. But it wasn't exactly clear. Hopefully MHSA has provided some clarity on that. It didn't specify mask rules for referees. It also didn't specify any season schedule or timelines, nor did it talk about face guards on hockey helmets as an alternative to masks. What it did do is provide this particular graphic, and I'm not going to belabor this too much except to use this as a transition point for Mark and say that I did a quick rundown, Mark, and took sort of this basic grid and applied it to MHSAA sports. And so I'm going to ask you if you could take a look at that. Does that about capture it? Do you see any gaps? And is water polo an MHSAA sport? No. Okay. So that's where I think water polo would fit, but that's just my best guess. Again, it's going to be up to sports organizers to determine which of these sports fall in which categories. So with that, that's what I had to share. I'm going to stop my share. I'm happy to take any questions, but I can also hand it off to Mark, who can provide some more details on these things.
Great. I don't see any questions posted yet, so we may as well just keep rolling. And having already seen Mark's slides, I know that there's going to be kind of like the part B to what Bob just shared. So thank you so much for being with us today, Mark.
You bet, Wendy. Thanks. Bob, wonderful job. I'm going to share my screen here. And again, Ryan has gotten a copy of my slide deck as well. I apologize in advance. There is far too much information on each of these slides. As educators, you're probably cringing. I did this, though, because, again, if these slides are going to be available to you after our meeting today, I wanted them to be as information-rich as possible. So really going to build on what Bob did. Wonderful summary. I'm going to just start first that we have tried, and when I say we, it's not only our staff, but certainly Vic is our longest serving board member, our representative council, and so many of our schools, is we have tried to be advocates for athletics. Our advocacy has tried to be very much data driven. This data really falls into three different groups. The first is our experience with fall sports. In all of our fall sports, we had 95% plus of our schools that were able to play each and every week. Yes, we did have some positive cases. Yes, there were in some school communities that had outbreaks, which required a pause or a delay, but a very successful fall season. The pilot program, which MDHHS created so we could finish our 3 winter championships. As you can see, there were 5,300 individuals. That was primarily players and coaches involved in the pilot program during December and January. Of those 5,300 individuals, there were 57 positive rapid tests. That's 1%. So that data exceeded our expectations. Of the 3 tests per week that those individuals were conducting, the negative test rate for those were 99.8%. Other than my cardiologist in my airline pilot, I think most of us, 99.8% is a pretty good percentage in most walks of life. And again, incredibly pleased with that data. Remember, these were 3 sports, 2 of which were exclusively indoor sports. And the reality is that most football teams, given the weather, were practicing a good amount of the time during January. And for those numbers to come back the way that it did, I certainly think that set the table for winter sports to restart. And last but not least, we're now one of 40 other states who are currently participating in winter sports. I'll focus in on our three neighbors. Indiana and Ohio have been playing all winter sports, including wrestling, since November. And in those two southern states, when all of those kids compete, it is without a mask. Full disclosure, I have an 8th grade daughter who's a pretty decent basketball player. She has gone to Warsaw, Indiana a couple weekends in the last month. And I can tell you that masks were on in Indiana at all times, except when kids were on the floor playing. That has been what's happened in Indiana since November. And so that to me is encouraging. And it's encouraging because I'll connect the dots here to the data in just a second. Our other neighbor, Wisconsin, they've also been playing all winter sports. The difference in Wisconsin is they have been wearing masks in many of those sports. The encouraging part of this is you look at what our COVID data has done since mid-November. The percentage of daily cases is down roughly 75% in Michigan. And we have to credit Governor Whitmer and MDHHS for those decreases. Positive test rates have improved by almost 60%. Again, in Michigan, we've done some really good things here over the last 2.5 months. What gives me great optimism is our three neighboring states have seen similar decreases in their COVID numbers as well. Wisconsin, they've actually seen better decreases in daily cases and positive test rates in Michigan, and they have been playing winter indoor sports this entire time. So again, there's some experiences here of our three neighbors, which I think gives all of us some hope for some real optimism moving forward. So here's the update. As Bob covered, basketball and ice hockey, they were able to begin games this week. Competitive cheer and wrestling, they can begin competing on Friday. And the contact practices in these sports were permitted as of Monday. Wrestling is the one and only sport where testing is required. I think all of us as school administrators, going back to August, as we've sat back and we thought about sports, I think many of us thought that, you know what, athletics are going to be doable. If there's one hurdle that's going to be higher than the others, it's wrestling. And that's why I think it just makes some common sense of why wrestling is going to be treated differently than all of our other winter sports. The way that the wrestling requirement works is that kids will be required to have a negative rapid test the day before competition. All of our weigh-ins this year in wrestling will be happening at home schools. This eliminates schools traveling and showing up at a location 2 or 3 hours before the meet to weigh in on site. We're doing all home weigh-ins the day before, and that will coincide with rapid testing. So if a wrestling team is going to compete twice during a week, they're going to have to test twice, each time the day before competition. Know that the test will be distributed to our wrestling schools at no cost by MDHHS, and the pickup spots for these tests will be local ISD facilities. And as I said earlier, wrestling must test the day before each competition, and an administrator has to sign that home weigh-in form, which this year will not only confirm that the weights are accurate, but it will also be an attestment that all of those listed eligible wrestlers did have a negative rapid test as well. So that will be the way. And of course, these weigh-in sheets get exchanged with opponents, and that's the way for total transparency. And that's the way that we'll be able to enforce this as well. Let me quick jump to this other slide just to kind of do some rumor control. This is a slide from the MDHHS. And as you can see, because we've already had several questions about this today. So in contact sports where masks cannot be safely worn, and as Bob said, we as the sports organizer, in partnership with Health and Human Services, we've determined that the one sport where a mask cannot be worn safely is wrestling. We've made the determination that it can be done in basketball, it can be done in ice hockey, and it can be done in competitive cheer. Speaking of competitive cheer, I know that the American Association of Pediatrics has some guidance out there about cheer and stunting. Know that that is different than what our governing body and their sports medicine advisory committee has put out there. So just know that we got our own sports medicine advisory committee to ring in on cheer. MDHHS does consider it a non-contact sport. So that's why cheer is going to be able to move forward with masks at all times, but will not test. Here's what's causing confusion. MDHHS will supply our wrestling schools with 3 tests per week. This simply is the quantity of tests that they are giving wrestling schools. Note that there is not the requirement that wrestling tests 3 times a week. So the wrestling requirement is day before competition. And no, for wrestling this year, we made a tweak. Wrestling schools at the high school level may only compete twice a week. So wrestling schools will have an extra test that they're going to be given. But just know that this reference is about the supply of tests. As Wendy and Bob both mentioned earlier, other sports can elect on an option to get tests from MDHHS to test in those other sports as well. As the slide clearly says, testing in those sports is completely optional. Also know that if a district does choose to test their hockey players or their basketball players, know that those kids during games still have to wear a mask. So testing does not get the non-wrestlers out of wearing a mask. And the important distinction here is MDHHS will give the non-wrestling sports, they will give test quantities to schools of 1 test a week. So please know that this is not setting up a 3-time-a-week requirement for wrestling. It does not suggest a 1-time requirement for other sports. This is simply the quantities that schools are getting. And maybe I'll just ask Wendy and Bob, are you getting that same information? I just thought it was important to clarify the expectations here.
I personally haven't heard that question, but I think I'm glad that you're making that point. So just to make sure I heard you correctly, you're saying that wrestling has been determined to be the one sport that you cannot safely compete with a mask on. So that's the key point number 1. The key point number 2 is they must then, because of that, test once a week?
Well, that in wrestling, Wendy, they will test the number of times a week that they compete.
Okay.
And so this year, the 2 options for our high school wrestling teams, you can either compete once a week, which would mean 1 test for that week. Most of our wrestling schools, Wendy, the reality is we're allowing a maximum of twice a week, and that'll be what most of our schools do. Therefore, they'll be testing twice a week. So testing in wrestling, it's based on the number of competitions in a week.
And what you're saying is that MDHS is providing up to 3 times a week. So if for some reason somebody wanted to test 3 times a week, they could. All right. So I don't know if you want to speak to this now, or maybe if Vic wants to speak to this, but what would be your recommendation then with wrestling? Would they be doing that testing like the day before a competition, like along with weigh-in?
Yeah, so that actually is our recommendation, Wendy, that teams will practice the day before a meet. Typically, the home weigh-in then is done after practice, before kids leave, in really getting that set up to where you can handle both the home weigh-in as well as the rapid test. What our pilot schools back in January found is that testing doesn't take all that long. The most labor-intensive part of it is actually inputting results electronically into their online portal, but that is how this will work. You'll do your home weigh-in and testing together after practice the day before that. Transition, as Bob mentioned, to face masks. Again, masks are required at all times. They're even required at all times in wrestling, except when a kid walks to the table to check in for his or her match. Once they then head out into the circle, that's when the mask can come off. We give it to a coach or someone in our corner. The athletes then compete during the match. As soon as the match ends, I head back to my corner and the mask goes on for all time. So the only time period that our wrestlers will be unmasked is when they're actively competing. And obviously, the other time where kids will not be masked are when they're in the water. Remember that face mask, the requirement is all times in, again, the three sports of basketball, competitive cheer, and ice hockey. And I'll just repeat it again, even if those individuals in those non-wrestling sports have gotten a negative test, they still have to wear a mask at all times. Enforcement has been an issue already. We've got a lot of people out there with, it seems like, spare time. And so I am getting link after link to online photo albums of games the night before where masking is not been very good. Different than the fall, we're getting our officials to help us with enforcement. That in the little saying that we've come up with is, if we see your nose, the whistle will blow and out you will go. So the mask needs to be over the mouth and nose. And if you can see an individual's nose, the official will tell them and by the way, this is no different in basketball than the rule where you got to have your jersey tucked in. First thing you say, hey, 14, tuck in your jersey. Hey, 14, pull the mask up. If that doesn't happen, we'll blow the whistle, we'll stop the game, and out you go. The reality is that if we don't all work together in enforcing this, MDHHS could step in at any time and pause or pull the plug on our season. So this is something we all have to work together. Very briefly, because Bob did a great job with spectators, large, huge facilities, it's 500. If you're under 10,000, the maximum is 250. But as Bob said, if your gym is smaller than capacity of 1,250, which by the way, 20% of that is 250. So if your gym seats less than 1,250, you're going to be limited to 20% of that capacity. So a very small school, our gym only seats 500. That does not mean that you get 250. It means that you get 20% of your 500 capacity, which in that case would be 100. If your facility doesn't have any fixed seating, I'm thinking like a large ice rink facility, and your school plays a game on the back rink that's normally just used for figure skating and hockey practice. There's no bleachers at all, and pretty much folks just stand around the boards and the glass with no fixed seating. That would fall under the facility that is limited to 100. And there's also, I think, some math, is there not, Bob, about number of people per square feet with no fixed seating. But if you fall into that, you can go back and find that in the order. Anything else, Bob, we missed on the whole spectator capacity? I know this is a big question that our administrators get from moms and dads and grandpas and grandmas right now.
No, I think you covered it on spectator capacity.
And then, as Bob also mentioned, MDHHS did make a recommendation that schools can limit it to 2 per participant. This was actually our limit during the pilot program, and I would have been quite pleased if MDHHS would have just made this the rule. They didn't. So as Bob said, that's just a recommendation. What our legal counsel tells us all the time is follow the order, and we're going to do so based on the 500, 250, or 20% number.
But nothing, Mark, nothing prevents a school from imposing a stricter limit, right?
Exactly right. Yep. We've even got a few schools that will go 0, believe it or not. So depending on your facility. Concessions, the current order does allow concessions, just like at a movie theater. Just speaking colleague to colleague, I think concessions will be doggone tough to pull off. Because what you're going to need to do is you have to make sure that people are consuming their bottle of water or their bag of popcorn only when they're seated. And everybody is separated by at least 6 feet. And those people have to be seated at a table in groups of less than 6, and they cannot intermingle. To me, that just sounds like an awful lot of red tape to try and sell some bottled water and some popcorn. So schools want to be creative, follow the order, but that's just our very practical guidance when it comes to that. Do know that our staff and the council has been completely focused on getting regular season started. We will be ringing in soon on winter tournament details. Do know that all of our dates have been finalized. They're on our website. but, confirming all of our host sites. How are we, for host sites, how are we going to split up the money? Those kinds of things that'll be finalized and shared very, very soon. Let me talk candidly here about the spring break dilemma. 63% of our schools in Michigan have spring break the week of March the 29th. Many schools have opted into this week traditionally. So now you get kids back in school the first full week of April prior to the state testing window. I think you go back a handful of years, most schools tended to be on the first full week of April. By those percentages, you can see that those have changed a little bit. And then the remaining 37% are on the week of April 5, which I believe this year is leading into Easter week. So really all of our schools fall in one of 2 weeks. Know that all of our winter tournaments, including skiing, which by the way, that is the one sport we have not yet gotten complaints about wearing a face covering, is in skiing. So I want to thank our ski community for not beating us up with that. Thanks for getting my poor attempt at humor there. But ski, bowling, swimming and diving in both the lower and upper peninsulas, gymnastics, and even 2 of the sports that got a late start, ice hockey and competitive cheer, the finals in those tournaments will all be done by March 27th. So kids, in those entire sport communities, we've got the finals done by the time you head off on spring break. Now, I realize the way that spring break has evolved over the years, that people that are going to travel, they disappear on Wednesday. But the reality is those sports will all be done by that Saturday. Only 2 sports will continue into either the first week of spring break for some schools, or we'll use both weeks. And those 2 sports are basketball and wrestling. There was no way that we could give a decent regular season experience and get a tournament done by March the 27th. The good news, our basketball districts will conclude on March the 27th. So what this means is that 80% of our basketball players, will be done by spring break starting. So we'll have 20% of our basketball schools involved in regionals through finals that will play over those 2 weeks. Wrestling regionals are all done on March the 27th. So the only wrestlers that will continue to compete that week of March the 29th, it's only our finalists. It's only our team finalists, and it's only our individual finalists. Now, we have gotten lots of nasty emails, mostly from parents, some coaches, a few administrators, about how in the world we could schedule things over spring break. And our response to that would be, how in the world can we not schedule things this year over spring break? Given the fact that we still have national travel restrictions in place, that if we would have not scheduled, if we would have, for example, had a 2-week break in our basketball tournament or a 2-week break for our wrestling finals, the optics of that politically during a pandemic to basically wink, wink, go ahead and travel would have put us in an almost impossible situation. Again, during a pandemic, for us to have even implicitly encouraged folks to travel would just have been a bad look. We've heard over and over and over about how important athletics are, about how important it was for us to advocate, to give our kids a chance to play, especially our seniors. I have a pretty short tolerance level for now these emails that I'm getting from mom and dad to where they're out $1,500 on their deposit for their condo in Florida or Gulf Shores. Also know this, in many school communities in our state, spring break simply means that we don't have class. There are many areas based on the socioeconomics to where folks are not traveling for spring break. And for us to have built in some kind of a spring break pause would have said, well, we see that your rules are going to make sure to cater to the affluent in those more diverse areas. We're going to give those kids and communities less respect. So that's just a very blunt reality of the other side of that coin. We would have gotten criticism, whatever we would have done. All of you in decision-making chairs have known that that just is the deal during COVID. We did our very best to try and get as many kids done in winter as possible by that magic date of March the 27th. So I'm off the soapbox, but wanted to give you the thinking and rationale behind the spring break dilemma. The last domino yet to fall, the last date we have to set is the start of spring sports practices. All of our school ADs got this 2-question survey yesterday. There's a deadline on this at the end of this week. We're going to get the council together to make a decision by February the 19th. And the 2 questions were, for the start of spring sport practices, our school prefers to either start on time, which is Monday, March 15th, or to push back the start of spring practice later than the 15th. So those 2 questions. And then the second question is, if we're going to start practice later than the 15th, what do you prefer? Move it back 7 days later to the 22nd, move it back 9 days later to the 24th. You'd say, why 9 days? Well, the theory there is if you move it back to the following Wednesday, the first 2 nights of district basketball have been completed, which eliminates almost half of your participants. So that's the 24th. And then last but not least, we would push it back 2 weeks. This is with the caveat, spring tournaments will not move. We are not going to push spring back. And of course, this is all predicated on us not having another pause or delay for winter or spring. But assuming everything is able to go from here on out, we might look at slightly delaying the start of spring practice, but with all spring tournament dates, it's just hard to hang on to seniors and kids much later into June. We will continue to communicate with our schools and with Wendy and with Bob and your entire organization. We try and share as much information back and forth. Yes, we do have communication with MDHHS, but they ultimately are the decision makers. And when their information and decisions change, we'll just try and keep everybody as updated as we can. And we're all finished. Before I hand it off to Vic, I just want to give a very simple but heartfelt thank you. Never been a more challenging time to be in leadership. The support that we have gotten from our schools, whether it be from our athletic directors, our principals, superintendents, school board members, it's been extraordinary. Please, for those principals and superintendents with us today, just know that our ADs have been absolute rock stars. They have had to rework schedules at the drop of a hat now at least half a dozen different times as timeframes and limitations have continued to be changed. Just again, if there was ever a year where you can really take care of and find a way to maybe recognize your athletic directors, this would be the year. And then last but not least, not just for today's session, our incredible thanks and appreciation to Wendy, to Bob, to Ryan, to all of our friends at MASSP, along with our friends at MASSAA, as well as the School Boards Association. This is really the last 11 months. We've really had to communicate and work together as we've tried to find certainty in a very uncertain world. So again, I would just like to end with a thank you to everyone that took time to join us today, but in particular to Wendy, Bob, and Ryan once again. So with that, thank you. And let me hand it off next to Vic, and I'll stop the share.
Hey, Mark, before you hand it off to Vic, could we hit you with a couple of questions?
Fire away.
All right. There's one in the Q&A. Was, can a coach every be masked? You talked about this a bit with athletes and masked, even if they were tested. Can you clarify that that applies to coaches too?
It does not. So anyone that tests other than a wrestler does not excuse them from the mask requirement. Do know, and I think all of you during the school day have had to work with the individual that has a medical intolerance for a mask, to where you require the medical documentation for those individuals. That could be someone that has a disability, for example, asthma, to where during the day they've been giving a waiver or clearance for that. We would handle coaches that same way. I know that we mentioned, Bob, in your slides about officials. know that the guidance that we've given officials is you have to wear a mask, especially in the 3 winter active sports of basketball, running up and down the floor, ice hockey, skating up and down the ice, in wrestling, being up and down and all over the mat. Those officials have to wear a mask. Those individuals, if they do have a medical reason why they cannot be masked, they would have to have that medical documentation in hand. And we have also told those officials that if you're in that situation, you have to reach out to every host school, because some of our school superintendents have said, you know what, if you're an outside person coming into our school community, is an independent contractor, we can choose who we use. And while you may have that medical situation, everyone working at Central High School has to wear a mask, period. So just know that that's the guidance that we've given our officials as well. So it's only the medical intolerance to where that would apply. Nobody other than wrestlers gets to test out of wearing a mask.
So you mentioned, or I think actually we were talking about this before we got on the webinar about hockey players and face shields. So are face shields that are part of the helmet serving in place of a mask, or is there an expectation that hockey players are going to wear an actual mask as well?
All of the guidance that we have gotten thus far during the school year, Wendy, with helmeted sports. So that was football in the fall, it was ice hockey currently, potentially could be boys lacrosse, that the full, we're not just talking the visor, it is the full, they refer to these as a splash guard, that has, that those would comply. Now, we were also told that at some point those would be, that specific question would be added and would appear in an FAQ. So we all have that specific answer in writing, and we haven't seen that yet. So we'll continue to push that does get spelled out, but that has been the interpretation for helmeted sports, which, like I said, football, ice hockey, and then potentially that would be how boys lacrosse would get handled in the spring.
You're not the only one asking, Mark. We've asked too.
Yep.
Bob, I'm sorry, did you grab the question that was in the Q&A? You did that one? Okay. Though I don't know what thumbs up. Did you ask? Okay, that one's gone. Great. Awesome. All right. So Vic, you have been around for a few years, in this role. And last time that we spoke, you gave the mention of a vendor you were using for sports ticketing, and a lot of people on the webinar grabbed that little nugget of information. So what advice do you have, as you're working with all the schools in the Catholic League? Are there certain areas you've spent more time providing guidance on? Like, are you talking more about venues and setup, or are you talking more about implementation of one thing or another?
Wendy, that's one of the reasons I love you so much. You're so polite. Instead of calling me old, you find a way to say that I've been around a little bit. But first, let me start by saying many of you hear the phrase, you see someone in a different light, right? I have been on, I'm not exaggerating, over 100 Zoom meetings with Mark. And I see him in the same light. He's sitting at the same desk. I see that same light behind him all the time. And I was part of the council and the committee when we hired Mark. Everybody thought, well, that's probably a pretty good choice, but let's see how he does in the situations that Jack Roberts had to deal with. Maybe the change of season litigation or the Jewish Academy litigation. Then we'll see what kind of light we see him under. And I can tell you the council feels absolute 100% that we made the right call in hiring him as we go through this pandemic. The way he's handled it with not just the schools, but with the various government offices he's worked with. So we're pretty proud of that. And I'm sure our schools are too. I wanted to talk a little bit about how some of these rules and regulations the state has made on.
Hey, Vic, you froze up on us. I'm hoping you can hear me.
I'm afraid I lost my connection there.
Yeah, you did for a second.
Yeah, did I come back in?
Yeah, you're back in now.
Yeah, see, you say nice things about Mark. See what happens when you say nice things about Mark? You know, even the Zoom gods get rid of you, right? But a couple of things about these regulations and how they're handled by schools. In some ways, we can take it to our advantage. What we've done in our league is we're using the 2 family member requirement for each participant. We don't want student sections there. We want to try to eliminate the large gatherings. So we're allowing each participant 2 family members in attendance. They can't trade them off to give them to students or friends. It could be a mother and a daughter, or a mother and a father, or 2 brothers, or however they choose to do that. Then what we found, if we do it that way, the biggest problem we had in the fall was at 2 per participant. You had to empty the gym in order to bring in the varsity game, if you would, right? The JV game ends, you got to empty everybody out, clear everybody out one door, bring everybody in another, so you never get over that maximum. With a maximum of maybe up to 250, depending on your size of your gym, you can then bring in the varsity parents without exiting the JV parents first and still not go over the limit. So we think that will be a big help. That, coupled with the fact that most recent documentation shows that it's droplets, not surface, that spreads the virus more. So while we're still concerned with disinfecting the seating areas for the participants because of the sweat, we're not as concerned with disinfecting the bleachers every time a group of parents enter or leave. So the big concern is we're disinfecting the equipment being used and the benches and the areas where there might be droplets on. We've had some officials ask if they can touch the ball, because some schools are asking officials to not touch the ball, and they're kicking it to the free throw shooter, for example. And we're allowing officials to touch the ball. We're just reminding everybody that we're disinfecting things frequently. There's hand sanitizer at the scorers table for the officials. Every time there's a whistle, they can go over there and use it should they choose. Plenty of hand sanitizer for the athletes themselves. But I do think that the 2 family members, up to 250, if you had to, would help when we switch. The other part of that really helps is busing. For volleyball, you often had to provide transportation for 2 individual teams, because the JV couldn't stick around to watch the varsity. They would have put them over the capacity. So now, if a bus brings the JV and varsity, the varsity can come early, watch the JV without going over spectator limits, and the JV could remain, go home on the bus without going over spectator limits for the varsity game also. So there are some advantages to using the 2 per participant recommendation without going over the 250 requirement, if you would. And many of my schools are less than 250 anyways. If you're under, as Mark said, 1,250, that number will go down. I don't think Mark mentioned this, but I don't believe sideline cheerleaders count as spectators. They do count as participants at a basketball or hockey game, if you would. And they would be allowed also to have 2 family members in attendance too.
And actually, Vic, thank you, Vic, if I can. We've said that any athletic department connected group, so that would be sideline cheer. In some schools, that would be pom-pom. In some schools, that would be a dance team. It's up to the school district. If they're going to determine that they are participants, they may do so and be able to give those kids a chance. The one question we have gotten, well, what if we have a small pep band? Well, bands are not part of athletic departments. So if a school is going to allow a small pep band to play, they would need to be spaced. It would have to meet all of the capacity requirements. And then the guidance would be that that small pep band is you'd have to count every one of those individuals as a spectator. So just the context for that. And I appreciate Vic's reminder.
Yeah, along with the sideline cheer, the other thing is, as stipulated in the MDHHS orders, are singing. If somebody is performing an anthem or singing, they need to be 6 feet apart from anybody without that mask while they sung. So just a reminder of that. Mark mentioned, and I really like this, if the nose shows, the whistle blows thing. That's very catchy. But most of us know how our officials are. Some say, yeah, they know some of the rules even, but they do know what aren't their rules and what isn't their responsibility. And a lot of them are going to feel like it's really not their job to usher a player off the floor if they're not wearing their mask. While we hope they will, that mandate is on the coaches and administrators. The thousands of people that went to Lansing and said, we want to play, and said they will honor the rules if we're allowed to play, those are the same people that need to step up here and make sure everybody's wearing their mask. The last 2 mornings, I've gone on social media and looked at my school's videos and photos that are in a number of our local papers. And what I'm seeing is, while there are quite a few students whose masks are below their nose and a few that are even below their mouth, it's the same kids. I looked at 23 pictures from one game last night. 18 of them were great. Everybody in the photo had their mask fully on. The 5 that didn't, it was the same girl who had her mask either just below her nose or at her chin. To me, that's not an official's problem. That's a coach's problem. That girl was taking advantage of the fact that she's pretty talented. She may be the best player in the state, actually. And she was doing what she wanted to do. Our administrators need to handle it. We need to continually remind them it's their job to make sure their players are wearing their masks, are fully wearing their masks. Mark had mentioned the spring break dilemma. There's one other dilemma for any of you who are part of the Catholic faith or have students that are. And, the boys' regional finals are going to be held on Holy Year. The rest individual finals are held on Good Friday. For many Catholics, those are just 2 days that you can't or shouldn't participate. You should know that the council, the hands are tied because of the lawsuit with the Jewish Academy. The MHSAA needs to be religion neutral, if you would. And they cannot switch games or not schedule events on religious holidays because of some legal action that was taken against them years ago. So if that question comes to you in your capacities, that should be how you answer it. And then finally, 2 more things. Back to the spectators for a minute. If a school decides they're not having spectators in their building, our league rule is that they can't bring them when they're on the road either. So we feel like it's not fair if they think bringing all those communities together is bad. Person or help that they enforce that both ways. And then finally, and I keep feeling like I'm breaking up here, but finally, I was asked to serve on the another governor's advisory council, which was like the last thing I wanted to do, but it is called, instead of the roadmap, it's the road to recovery. And it's to help our students, not just our student athletes, but all of our students with mental health, help get them through the mental health issues and the educational issues that they're going to have to battle in the coming months. So if any of you have any suggestions on programs or areas that can help in that, I would love to hear from you, and I will share them with that council. I'll put my information in the chat, my cell phone and my email. I'd love to hear with any suggestions you might have on that. So,
Well,
thanks, Wendy.
you covered quite a few things, as I knew you would, Vic, that were really just good food for thought. And just I know that people don't like the idea of fighting with kids about masks and parents and things, but the bottom line is, that's definitely needs to be a talking point with parents and with students. Like, hey, we all wanted to play. Everybody said, we'll do whatever the rules are. So I think just a good reminder about that is important. And I think that goes along with the spring break thing as well, that Mark mentioned, like, hey, this is our opportunity to play. And, let's not, be upset about, how things aren't exactly the way we'd like them to be, when the bottom line is we're getting that opportunity. So I think you made a lot of really good and helpful points. And Mark, your slides were great. And I know one of the things that Bob and I are interested in is, how do we get the discussions going already about spring sports, sooner rather than later. Like, okay, what are the spring sports that maybe masks won't work for? What will the protocols look like? And certainly this is a very evolving situation. We understand that. But the more things that could maybe be discussed or determined in advance, the better, I think, for everyone. And I'm sure you would agree with that.
Yeah, and the one comment actually on spring, and I'm knocking on every piece of wood, is I have great optimism for the spring based on our fall experience. 100% of our spring sports are outdoors, so the indoor issues go away. In truth be told, other than boys lacrosse, which is the one contact sport, in girls soccer, really baseball, softball, track, tennis, golf, so many of those sports, I think, we'll be able to do safely. So fingers crossed, but I do think, and I think as we sat here back in August, we said, what's going to be the easiest season of the three? And I think we all would have said spring, and hopefully that turns out to be the case.
Well, thank you both again. And, I also appreciate just, the fact that, we've continued this conversation. And, when I listen to you, Mark, talk about, hey, here's some things that I'm already hearing about. And Vic, even, in terms of the faith-based conflict with those dates, it is helpful for administrators to hear those things, because you can already put those together with slides or in communication that you do, knowing that it's probably going to come up. So I think those were great things. So as things go along and different things develop, we would love to hear from you. Hey, here's the answer we have on this frequently asked question, because we'll probably be hearing that as well as administrators. So thank you so much for your time today. Once again, we will share the recording of this presentation along with the slides that were shared. And we look forward to being able to get that information out there. And thank you again, everyone, for your time.